Hi, welcome back to The Basement. I'm Steve Lewis. Today we begin a brand new series here in The Basement featuring Carl Wilson. In these episodes we'll be looking at guest appearances that Carl made on other people's records outside the Beach Boys. In some cases he's joined by a Beach Boy or two, but this is pretty much Carl working with other artists away from the group. Now, of course, in the 1960s, Brian had by far been the most likely to work outside the confines of the Beach Boys. Somewhere in the early 70s that changed, and from there on until the end of his life, Carl became far and away the most likely member of the original members of the Beach Boys to guest appear on somebody else's record. As you can imagine, there is a lot of material to get to. I'm going to try to be complete and I'm going to go chronologically, but rather than do a super multi-part series and devote maybe the next third of a year to this, I think we'll do a couple of episodes now that should get us up into the mid-70s or so. Then we'll take a break, come back to it a little later on. Now, again, some of this is going to be a judgment call because I'm finding that in the 80s, you sometimes get like two Beach Boys who are billed as the Beach Boys. In other cases, you get pretty much the entire group, but they're all billed individually. I'm going to try to omit Beach Boy guest appearances, and also I'm going to try to omit any sort of Brian Wilson production or project that Carl might have guested on. In some rare cases, I'll just touch on those just to make sure that I haven't omitted anything. Anyway, a lot of this is going to be a judgment call, so hang in there with me. In putting these episodes together, I found it was interesting to look at some of the folks that Carl hung out with, at least professionally, some common connections, and also some tangentially related missed opportunities for the Beach Boys as a group. Now again, I'm going to try to be complete, but I suspect there are some Carl Wilson guest appearances that I'm not aware of. Keeping in mind that we are going chronologically, I hope you'll let me know if I missed anything. Right off, I suspect that there may be some early 60s records where Carl contributed some surf guitar that I don't know about. The first one that I do know about was released in March of 1963. It was a one-off by the Tri-5, Come and Get It, with Like Chop. Both sides of the single are public domain songs credited to Gary Usher and Mike Borchetta. In Becoming the Beach Boys, Jim Murphy reports that the lineup for this one-off instrumental single was Carl on lead guitar and Dennis on drums, with Gary Usher on rhythm guitar, Dick Burns on bass, and Randy Thomas on keyboards. The A-side was based on the traditional Polish or Czech melody known as Stodula Pompa, that was played by ice cream trucks cruising through Southern California neighborhoods like Hawthorne in the 50s and early 60s. The Beach Boys recorded a version of the tune around this time as Good Humor Man, and later Brian adapted it into The Rockin' Surfer on the Surfer Girl album. We talked about it in detail back in episode 99, Surfer Girl Side 1. The B-side, Like Chop, is based on the traditional chopsticks. The single is another one of Gary Usher's many side projects in the early 60s. As you'd guess, it's a rocked up, surfified party record, like many hundreds of other records released around this time. It does offer an early opportunity to hear Carl and Dennis working away from the group and away from Brian. If there are any others along these lines, I hope you'll pass it along. Carl working away from the Beach Boys really seems to kick off 8 years later in March of 1971 with the release of the Carl Wilson produced The Flame album. It's a very strong album from the group, their US debut. We talked about it extensively in episode 102, The Flame, so you can check it out in more detail there. Released just a couple of months later in May of 1971 was Charles Lloyd's Warm Waters album. On the track All Life Is One, Carl contributed Moog synthesizer and was part of a vocal chorus along with Mike, Alan, Brian, Billy Cowsill, Retta Hughes, and Michael O'Gara. This is another album that we've already talked about pretty extensively back in episode 79, Charles Lloyd Meets the Beach Boys. Next up is one we haven't really talked much about before, Cass Elliott's self-titled album, which was released on January 24th, 1972, and includes a version of Bruce Johnston's Disney Girls with a backing vocal by Carl Wilson, coming about 5 months after its initial release on the Surf's Up album. The liner notes on the album give general credits with no listings for the specific tracks. In addition to Carl, Bruce Johnston also sings backing vocals and is credited with Fender Rhodes. Liner notes also include backing voices on Disney Girls, The High Beach Mamas. Disney Girls is listed first on the back cover. It's side 2, track 2 of the album. The song has been substantially restructured. The original chorus, ending with Fantasy World and Disney Girls, I'm Coming Back, is treated as part of the verses here. The original middle section, beginning with Hi Rick and Dave, Hi Pop and Good Morning Mom, and ending with Church, Bingo Chances, and Old Time Dances, has been turned into the chorus. Only part of the third verse is used. Everything beginning with I've Got My Love to Give has been omitted. The middle section does not work particularly well as a chorus. I think maybe even Cass realized it. There are 3 choruses, and in the final one she just kind of scat sings parts of it, as if she knows it's already gotten too repetitive to just sing again without changing it up a little. The arrangement is pretty nice, featuring strummed acoustic guitar and gentle electric lead guitar. A tastefully restrained string section comes in partway through. The electric guitar and a Fender Rhodes, presumably played by Bruce, are used sparingly to make the track shimmer. There's a credit on the inner sleeve for a solo on Disney Girls. The symbol used in the footnote is applied to 3 names in the liner notes: Joe Osborne bass, Edward Green drums, and Michael Lang piano. The thing is, I don't really hear anything that sounds like what I'd call a solo on the recording. In direct contrast to the Beach Boys version, I don't even hear a piano on this version. There's what sounds to me like an edit coming off the final verse just before the song wraps up. It makes me wonder if maybe they decided to tighten the song up at the last minute and cut whatever instrumental solo or solos had been there. Also, in contrast to the Beach Boys version, the backing vocals are used very sparingly. Cass mostly sings solo. The backing vocals appear 4 times, and they aren't even really backing vocals because the lead vocal drops out each time they come in. At the beginning of the song, there are oohs following the melody of Church, Bingo Chances, and Old Time Dances, and at the end of each chorus, the lead vocal drops out and the backing vocals take over for Church, Bingo Chances, and Old Time Dances. I'm not sure who the High Beach Mamas are, but my guess would be that it's Cass overdubbing herself multiple times, the way George Harrison had done on All Things Must Pass just over a year earlier, and credit it to the George O'Hara Smith Singers. In any case, there are a lot of voices in there. I think I maybe hear Bruce somewhere in the mix. I'm sure Carl is in there, but I've got to admit I don't really hear him. The song was released later in 1972 as the B-side of If You're Gonna Break Another Heart, which was the lead-off single for Cass's next album, The Road Is No Place for a Lady. Carl was credited with guitar on the Spring album, released in July of 1972. This features some great tracks, including one of my all-time favorite Beach Boy-related tracks, Sweet Mountain. Of course, this is a Brian Wilson co-production, and we already dedicated episode 45 to talking about the album, so I won't go into it here, but I did want to mention that. Released on October 20th, 1972, was Charles Lloyd's Waves album. Carl provided backing vocal on the track TM along with Mike, Alan, Billy Hinchy, and Pamela Pollard. This is another track I really like, roughly in the same vein as All This Is That. TM was also released as a single A-side on February 16th, 1973. Moving ahead almost a year from the release of the Waves album, we find Carl next guesting on the very obscure Amazing album by the very obscure Kathy Dalton. This was released on October 15th, 1973. Kathy Dalton had reportedly been in an LA folk rock band called Gas Company in 1965. She then joined Greg Dempsey in the Daughters of Albion before going solo. Greg Dempsey wrote and produced this entire album, which in the broadest terms is country rock boogie. The big draw here is that the backing band is Little Feat. Van Dyke Parks also appears on a couple of tracks that Carl does not appear on. The credits are peppered with hippie eccentricities like a lot of other records of the time. Also starring Clyde King and Jimmy Gilstrap, who sing between, behind, throughout. and Luli Jean Norman, who is the voice of the Jungle on Cannibal Forest and the Moonlight on Gypsy Dancer. Lowell George of Little Feat is also credited with backing vocals. Carl is listed under guest stars: Billy Hinchy, Carl Wilson, Jade Judson, Tony Martin Jr., and Vanilla Grits, backing vocal intricacies. The 1981 Surf's Up book credits Carl specifically on 5 of the album's 11 tracks. Ride, Ride, Ride features very self-consciously heavy lyrics typical of the time that haven't aged well at all. It's worse than the Stones' Heartbreaker, but not as bad as One Tin Soldier. It's a rocker with horns and so much else on it that the backing vocals are hard to hear at all, much less spot any specific singer. Gypsy Dancer is mid-tempo with more of an R&B feel to it. The backing vocals are much more prevalent, but I hear mostly female voices. I Need You Tonight is country gospel flavored with a vocal and structure reminiscent of Melanie's Lay Down Candles in the Rain. There's lots of group oohs and ahs, and Carl is in there somewhere, I suppose. Justine is the album's love song. It starts a little more spare than the other tracks, but by the end has built to the same arrangement of guitar, bass, drums, and big backing vocal and horn sections as most of the rest of the album. Once again, the background vocals are there, but it's the female voices in the foreground and really no discernible trace of Carl. Cannibal Forest gets a little funkier, and again the backing vocals are prominent, but it sounds like female voices that I'm hearing forward in the mix. I get the feeling that Greg Dempsey approached his writing for this album as a collection of styles. There's a rocker, a ballad, an R&B one, a 30s style one that sounds like Melanie imitating Bette Midler singing Puttin' on the Ritz. There's a country boogie, a gospel one, a funky one, etc. As far as the arrangements and production, every track has a lot on it. It's like they used every player on every instrument on every track, so despite having tried to vary the type of song, it all comes out largely the same. Maybe having heavy hitters on it like Little Feat, they were afraid to ask anybody to sit one out. I'll give Greg Dempsey some credit as a producer that he could pile so much onto every track and not have it come out sounding any muddier than it does. The album isn't actively terrible, but I can't find anything memorable about it. Kathy Dalton's voice is okay, ranging somewhere between Melanie and a more restrained Bonnie Bramlett. I can't see anything particularly compelling about her. The songs sound like hundreds of other forgettable songs from the period. There's nothing unique enough about this album to give it any cult appeal, and nothing catchy enough about it to give it any broad appeal. I really wonder who they thought was going to buy this album apart from their friends and family, Little Feat completists, and dopes like me looking for Carl Wilson guest appearances. I'd like to know how Carl got involved in this. This is one where it's not really obvious. Presumably they had a friend in common, maybe Billy Hinchy or Tony Martin Jr. If anybody has any information on how Carl became involved in the Kathy Dalton album, please let me know. In any case, I think this is one of the Carl Wilson guest appearances where you are least likely to actually hear Carl Wilson in the mix. Released just 2 weeks after Kathy Dalton's amazing album came another Carl Wilson guest appearance on America's Hat Trick album, released October 29, 1973. The album was unique as the only one of America's first 6 albums not to contain a top 40 hit. The lead-off single, a cover of Willis Allen Ramsey's Muskrat Love, was the biggest hit on the album. It went to number 67. The Captain and Tennille's version will go to number 4 late in 1976. Carl, along with Bruce Johnston and Billy Hinchy, provides backing vocals on the title track Hat Trick. The title cut is credited to all 3 members of the group. It's a long track running 8 minutes and 29 seconds. As you might guess from those clues, they seem to have employed the old trick by 1973 of fusing a bunch of unfinished song fragments together into a suite. It begins very poppy with lots of backing vocals and bears a passing resemblance to Jewel's You Were Meant for Me from a couple of decades later. It transitions into a slightly harder rock section with electric guitar. There are lots of nice backing vocals in this section, though I can't specifically swear I'm hearing Carl. The just a little of nothing part here sounds very like Carl is in there somewhere. That's followed by a piano solo section with an orchestra coming in that introduces a more somber vocal section before it moves into a more straightforward, bouncier pop rock tune with some oohs in the backing vocals. It's all very melodic and all very Beatle-esque. Of course, the Beatles were kind of pioneers at weaving song fragments together like this. This won't be Carl's last endeavor with America in general, or America's Jerry Beckley in particular. More about that to come. Next time, we'll pick up with the two biggest songs that Carl ever participated in outside the Beach Boys. I imagine you've probably guessed what those are, but please join me anyway. Meanwhile, I'd love to hear your comments on this, and if I missed any Carl Wilson guest appearances kind of up through 1973, please pass that along. Lots of other questions in there I hope someone will answer. In any case, love to hear your thoughts on this. Please hit like and subscribe if you haven't done that already. That is always helpful and much appreciated. Have a great week, and we will see you next time. Thanks for watching. Bye.